to your 2.5 years of not being with people. It's awesome to be with people. And I understand, Jody, this is like the first of your hybrid situation. So we are the guinea pigs. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. So if you throw anything at me during the presentation, try not to let it get into the camera because it'll disturb the folks at home. Hey, while Jody's in the mode of giving commercials, tomorrow on our Facebook Live page at the library, I'll be talking about Thanksgiving. I'll be doing a program on Thanksgiving and the Roosevelt and the presidents with Thanksgiving and such. And it's called, I forget exactly what the title is. I think it's like Thanksgiving, traditional American holiday time for turkey and tension. Okay, so we'll be talking a little bit about, Jody had mentioned if you're sick of your family, we'll be talking a little bit about, dealing with family and stuff, because the Roosevelts had some issues with that as well. So, yeah, so I'm delighted to be here. And today we're going to talk about Japanese American incarceration. Now, for years and years and years, yes. You can't hear back there? Could you maybe move up front a little? How about everybody else? Can everybody else?
There's the mic.
I don't know. Do you have a mic, Jody?
I do.
Please hold while Jody gets the mic. So I'll tell you, while we're waiting, I'll tell you my favorite library joke. Want to hear my favorite library joke? So there's this library and this chicken walks in and it goes up to the circulation desk and it goes, book, 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 right? And so the librarian's like, okay, she hands him 3 books. Chicken walks out. About 10 minutes later, chicken walks in, puts the books in the return slot, and goes over to the librarian and says, book, book, book. Right, so, okay, so she hands him 3 more books, and the chicken walks out, and lo and behold, 15 minutes later, the chicken walks back in, puts the books in the return thing, goes over and says, book, book, book. All right, so now the librarian's got, that's kind of suspicious. The 3rd time a chicken's been in here doing this. So she gets coverage for the desk and she says, I'm going to follow that chicken. So she gives him the 3 books. The chicken walks out and chicken goes down the street, goes down into a meadow, crosses over to a pond, and the chicken hands the books to a frog and the frog says, read it, read it, read it. I love that joke. And that's public domain now, so you can use that joke. At Thanksgiving, you can use that joke if you'd like to do that. You missed my chicken joke, my librarian chicken joke. Wait. This is just adding to suspense for the talk.
Hello. It's not working. Web works wonderfully. We used it on Sunday. It was fantastic.
I'll go get that. I haven't used this one in a while.
All right, so now I'll tell you my dog joke. So this guy's got this dog, right? And the dog can talk, right? So he takes the guy takes the dog into the bar and he says to the bartender, hey, if I could prove to you this dog can talk, can I drink here for free tonight? And the guy says, sure, you can tell me that, teach me and show me that dog can talk. So he says, okay, great. So he sets the dog down on the stool and the guy says to the dog, okay, dog, I got a proof that you can talk to this guy. So I'm going to ask you a question. What do you find on the top of a house? And the dog says, roof. All right. And the bartender says, wait a minute now. No. You said if you could talk, that's what's on top of a house. So he said, all right, but that's, then that's it. He said, no, I can prove, I know this dog can talk. Get me another beer and I'll show you. Whoop, there we go. So the, yes, we can hear that. So the guy says, okay, dog, what do you get when you sit on sandpaper? What do you say when you sit on sandpaper? And the dog goes, ruff, right? And the guy goes, oh, come on, that is just ridiculous. That is just, So he says, no, I'm telling you, give me one more try, one more chance, one more try. So he says, all right. So he asks the dog, he says, okay, dog, who was the greatest baseball player of all time? And the dog goes, roof, right? And the guy, that's it, that's it. He throws him out into the street, and the dog turns to the guy and says, DiMaggio? All right, how's that? Can you hear me now? All right, good, good, good. So thank you again for being here, and sorry about those jokes, but again, you can use them wherever you like. So today we're talking about Japanese American incarceration. Now, for years and years and years, it's been called Japanese American internment, but internment actually has a different legal definition than incarceration. And what we're beginning to notice, and what we're really beginning to try to address, is that what happened, we're not beginning to notice, we know that what happened with the Japanese American incarceration or internment was just flat out wrong. Okay, just flat out wrong. And to call it an internment is different than an incarceration, because it really was an incarceration. These folks had their rights taken away. They were put into these camps, and there was no real due process that you would get if you were interned someplace. That implies that you've gone through some due process, and that's not actually what happened. So the first thing I want to address is that Japanese American incarceration was probably one of the biggest blemishes on the Roosevelt record. Okay, there's no doubt about it. It was wrong. Okay, no doubt about it. Is this still not working? How's that? Good. All right.
That's much better.
Better? Okay, go. Thank you. So it's the biggest blemish, one of the biggest blemishes on the Roosevelt record. Okay, it was 120,000 Americans who were placed in these camps, removed from their homes, taken away from their places of business, their communities, and forced basically to watch the rest of the war from behind barbed wire. And so it's very difficult to make an argument around that or to get around that. So what I want to do, though, is I want to put it in some context why this happened. Okay, why did Roosevelt do this? And by doing this and placing the context and giving you the backstory, I'm not attempting to excuse what happened. I'm not attempting to excuse or justify for President Roosevelt. I'm simply giving you the what the history was that went in behind this, and it's kind of an interesting story. So to understand the Japanese American internment or incarceration, you really have to go back 2 months to December 7th, 1941. You really need to take a look at what happened at Pearl Harbor before you get into understanding what happened with the Japanese Americans. And there was a surprise attack, of course, on December 7th, 1941. President Roosevelt called it a date that will live in infamy, right? And we still remember it, years and years later. By the way, today is a historic day as well. It's the 59th anniversary, sad anniversary of President Kennedy's assassination. Right, so there's always history happening. And the surprise attack on December 7th, and I have a whole talk about that too, if anybody's interested, thank you. But the surprise attack on December 7th truly was a surprise attack. Now there's, people, what did Roosevelt know was going to happen? Did he let it happen? And that's all simply false. And, I'll come back another time and I can explain all of that to you as well. But let's take a look at what this attack was all about. It was a surprise attack on a Sunday morning. All right, and this attack at Pearl Harbor was very much like what we've experienced in our own lives, the 9/11 attack. Right, it changed our perspective, it changed our position in the world, and the world changed from that moment on. Right now, you can't get onto the plane without taking your shoes off and all the rest of that sort of stuff. Surprise attack on December 7th was pretty much the same thing. It was an attack on a Sunday morning. And Sunday morning is supposed to be a sacred time, right? Whether you're religious or not, it's Sunday morning, right? You're going to sleep in, maybe you get up, you go to church, you take the family out for breakfast. It is a time that is really, really important to most Americans, especially in the 1940s, right, the 1930s and the 1940s. So it was a total shock to have this thing happen on a Sunday morning. It was also a shock because the Japanese diplomats had been in Washington, D.C., telling us that they wanted to calm things down. There was tensions rising between the United States and Japan, and the Japanese diplomats were actually in the White House talking with the president and the Secretary of State, saying, look, we don't want any trouble from you guys any more than you want trouble from us. So let's get this thing worked out. Let's get this thing straightened out. And we believed them. And the reason we believed them was because we had broken the Japanese diplomatic codes. So we were listening in directly from Tokyo as to what the government there was telling these diplomats to say to us when they got to Washington, D.C. So we're listening in, okay, they want to calm things down, they want to calm things down. Then there's a knock on the door, in comes the ambassador, hey, we want to calm things down, So we believed these guys because we had already known what they were going to say when they got there, because that's what they were being told to say from Tokyo. And the attack came again on that Sunday morning, and it killed over 2,000 people in just a couple of hours. The USS Arizona, one ship, went down with over 1,100 men on that ship. Many of them still interred there to this day. So this was a big deal. This was a big deal. So that's what was going on with this. In the rest of the world, if we look at the rest of the world, the Nazis had overtaken Europe. And France had fallen, and France was supposed to be, with the Maginot Line, supposed to be, unfallable, but they fell. England was barely holding on, right, just 20 miles off the coast of continental Europe. The British were sitting there, being blitzed eventually, in 1941. They were waiting for the Nazis to come across the channel. The Nazis never did physically. They bombed from across the channel and such. But England, our big ally, was just barely hanging on to itself over there. The Italians, the German allies, were all across northern Africa, right, from Somalia all the way on over to Morocco, and Japan was sweeping across the Pacific Rim, right, taking over island after island, country after country, moving into China, moving into Manchuria, and they were on the move because they were looking for resources. Right, Japan was an island. They'd used up all their resources hundreds of years ago. And so they needed oil, they needed scrap iron in order to fight the war and to make the war effort. So the world is going to hell in a handbasket, basically, right? You've got a war going on in Europe, you got a war going on in the Pacific, you got Nazis running around, you got England barely clinging, France is occupied. This is what's going on in the world at the time. And there was a major miscalculation at Pearl Harbor. Major miscalculation. The United States on the morning of December 7th was ranked anywhere between 14th and 17th in military power in the world at that time, depending upon whose number you use. So imagine we are 17th or 14th, in ranking in military power in the world, and we ended up putting all of our eggs pretty much in one basket. The idea of Pearl Harbor was to build up this base. It had this base about a third of the way across the Pacific Ocean. That's, Pearl Harbor is about a third of the way across. It was an American territory, and our strategy was to build up this big base out there that would then project power into the Pacific Rim to get the Japanese to behave, right? When I talk to the students about this, I kind of say it's kind of like when you're at lunch, at school, right? And the lunch lady walks by, and all of a sudden, you're eating your stuff really good and everything, right? And then the lunch lady walks away, and you start flinging potatoes and those sorts of things. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be our lunch lady. Or I guess for adults, it would be you see the cop and you suddenly slow down. And then you drive by and you're back again, right? So Pearl Harbor was supposed to intimidate the Japanese into behaving. When I say behaving, I mean based upon what America wanted them to do, which was stop taking over all your neighbors, stop looking for these resources, and those types of things. And so as a result of that, what we did was we built up Pearl Harbor to be the largest military base outside of the United States. And we got this thing, and it was being built bigger and bigger every day. We didn't think the Japanese could ever attack it. Nobody had ever attacked anybody over that distance before, over 3,000 nautical miles. In the history of the world, nobody had ever been attacked that far. The supply lines would simply be too far. We thought that if there was to be an attack, it would be an amphibious attack. So that the Japanese, we thought they were planning to take over the island and then use it in reverse to project power into North and South America, particularly with an eye on the Panama Canal. Right, so we thought, well, if they do attack, they're not going to destroy the place. They're going to try to take it over, and they'll come on shore, and they'll take it over as intact as possible, so that they can just begin to use it as a base in the other way. The military was on high alert. And so the planes that were out there, in Pearl Harbor, they were spread all across the islands, and the Army, which was in charge of the Air Force at the time, the Army Air Corps, said, "No, this isn't good having these things spread all over. Let's put them all together where to keep an eye on them." Right, we put them all together, so it's much easier, right? If you guys were spread out all across this room, it would be hard for me to keep an eye on everybody. But when you're clustered together, I can see you right there. Right? So this was a miscalculation. That's a great idea to cluster your planes if you're worried about saboteurs, if you're worried about people coming onto the island. But it's not a good idea if there's an air attack, right? And a surprise air attack at that. The Navy got on a regular routine, and what they would do is they would go out on maneuvers, usually on a Wednesday afternoon. They would maneuver around out there in the ocean for a couple of days. They would come back on Saturday night. So Saturday night, put the ships back in bay, there you go, la-di-da, and the sailors hit the bars. And so come Sunday morning, they're hungover, okay? The Japanese spies saw this, and they said, hey, you're gonna attack, that's a good day to do it, right, Sunday morning. So we were prepared for an attack, but we were prepared for the wrong attack. We were prepared for an amphibious attack. We didn't think an attack could happen just based upon the distance, and we thought we were so smart by building this base bigger and bigger and scaring the Japanese. Meanwhile, the Japanese are looking at this and they're saying, wow, that base is getting bigger every day. And it's going to get to a point where it gets to be so big that they're going to be able to boss us around and tell us what to do out here. And so that's what led the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. We've got to knock this thing out before it gets so big. And their plan was to knock out the American fleet for 6 months to a year. And during that time, they were going to solidify their power across the Pacific Rim, and it was going to be too late for us to get back in the game at that point. So what you have are these two miscalculations that are going on. Now you might say, well, what does this have to do with Japanese-American internment? It has a lot to do with it, because we thought we had this problem licked. We thought we had this problem solved. And what ended up happening was we didn't. Now, while this is all going on out in the world, meanwhile, on the West Coast, there's a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. Right? These guys have been coming to the continental United States for generations, and it's the classic immigrant story, right? Immigrants come in, they do better than the locals, and there's resentment, right? And the Japanese Americans had come into the country, and they had worked hard. Many of them had families, and so their children became, citizens, were born here and were citizens. Many of them became citizens, and they did really well in 3 particular industries. They did really well in the citrus industry, they did really well in the trucking industry, and they did really well in the shipping industry. And these were 3 big industries out on the West Coast. And because these guys were doing so well, there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. They come here and they work for us, and now look at that, I'm working for them. I can't believe it, right? So there's a lot of this going on out there on the West Coast. And when the attack happened at Pearl Harbor, the politicians on the West Coast decided, hey, this is a great opportunity. Now this is a good chance for us to get ahead of this, okay? Because you know how politicians are, right? They like to lead by seeing where everybody is, then they run out in front and they pretend that they led, right? That's usually how it works. Like, oh, I knew this, I was right here, So that's what was going on out there as well. They said, hey, there's a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment going on. These guys just attacked Pearl Harbor. We can play off of this. This is great. We can work with this. And so they began to gin up this hatred of the Japanese even more, Right? They began to sort of say, hey, look, you know what? You guys are right. All these years you've been having these suspicions. Yeah, all right, now we're going to do something about it. And so they begin to pressure Washington, D.C. to do something about these Japanese. I'm going to show you a couple of things here that are going to be. So what ends up happening is the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, December 7th. Roosevelt doesn't know what's going on, right? He didn't expect that. Nobody expected that. The military has literally been caught with their pants down. Okay, it's like, wait a minute, we thought we had it all, all bundled up out there. We're 3,000 miles away. We're on regular rotations. We've, cozied up all the planes. We're ready for some kind of an attack, but we're not ready for that attack. And the military was, completely and totally humiliated and embarrassed. This was not supposed to happen. Okay, it's not supposed to happen. And it did. So between December 7th, 1941 and February of 1942, there is a 10 or 12-week debate that begins to go on in Washington, D.C. The Japanese-American internment or incarceration was not a knee-jerk reaction. Right? There was almost 2 months of talking about what to do about this thing. How was it going to happen? So there was public outcry, right? Because, hey, we just got attacked at Pearl Harbor. And prior to that, some people didn't want to get into the war. Some people did. Once the attack occurred, everybody was like, okay, we don't want to have to do this, but we got to do this. We've been attacked. We have to fight back. So that galvanized American support, against the Japanese, because they were the ones, of course, who had attacked us. And then meanwhile, you've got these politicians out on the West Coast that are saying, see, we told you we couldn't trust these guys. You got to do something about this. So Washington was getting political pressure from the governors, from the state attorney general. And the state attorney general in California happened to be a guy by the name of Earl Warren. Yeah, right. That name might ring a bell, right? He later becomes the Supreme Court Chief Justice. And ironically, today we're talking about, this and Kennedy assassination. He's also the guy that does the Warren Commission. Okay. So he becomes a very liberal judge later on, but at this point in his career, he's very, very much willing to play the game and to beat the drum for this sort of thing. Some people say that, maybe later on he becomes so liberal because he had guilt over, that in the early part. I don't know. I was never, in the man's head to talk about that. So now there's this, you've got the politicians drumming this up on the West Coast. You've got general public support about doing something about, Japan because they've attacked us. And in the government, there's this big debate. Secretary of War Stimson says, we've got to do something, right? We got to do something. We can't let this happen again. He's totally humiliated that the attack at Pearl Harbor has taken place, and it's such a debilitating attack. And it was only by luck that we were able to, pull ourselves out of that. So the War Department is saying we've got to do something about it. Over at the Justice Department, Secretary Biddle is saying that it would be wrong to do something. Right? We can't do anything. These aren't the guys that were flying the planes, right? We can't just arrest these guys. We can't do anything about these folks. These were not the folks that were in the planes. Now, maybe some of them on the ground have sympathy toward what happened. Maybe some of them on the ground are going to become spies or have loyalty to Japan, but we don't know that yet, right? They haven't done anything yet. So that means that anybody in this country is just as suspect as they would be. We can't do anything about it just yet. This is one of my favorite responses. J. Edgar Hoover, right? Remember that guy? Well, Hoover, luckily, had been spying on everybody, right? And so he had been keeping an eye on who he considered to be troublemakers. Right? And it didn't take much to be considered a troublemaker by J. Edgar Hoover. In fact, in our archive, we have the FBI file on none other than Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's over 3,000 pages. And at the time, it was the largest file on an American citizen. right? Because you know how subversive she was, you know, Eleanor Roosevelt, right? So what happens is Hoover walks in and says, listen, don't anybody worry. I got it all figured out, okay? I've been keeping an eye on the troublemakers, and he sends to the White House, here's the thing to General Watson, Paul Watson, who's one of FDR's advisors. He says, I thought it might be of interest to the president and you to have the enclosed charts before you, which show the number of Japanese, German, and Italian aliens taken into custody by the FBI as of December 9th, right, which is basically 48 hours later, right? This gives the exact location of the numbers apprehended and places at which they were apprehended. So he sends this note to the White House along with 3 charts. And the first chart, I know you really can't see this, but the first chart is 1,212 Japanese aliens, okay, basically people that were here, rounded up and taken into custody within 48 hours of the attack at Pearl Harbor. So Hoover's perspective on this is, we don't need to do anything else. I got the bad guys. You ever notice how, like in town, like whenever something goes wrong, there's always that one family that's behind it all, right? Okay, you know, like something happens and the police go right to that house because they know somehow they were involved with it. Okay, that's kind of what this was all about. So 1,212 Japanese aliens apprehended, taken into custody by the FBI by 7:30 a.m. December 9th, 1941. 620 Germans taken into custody by the FBI and 98 Italians. Okay, so the Japanese by far win the prize for being taken into custody. Okay, and a lot of that has to do simply with racism, right? They look different. And it was their country that attacked us, you know, or their ancestral country. And so that's what ended up going on with that. So Hoover says it's not necessary. Justice Department says we can't do anything about it because they haven't done anything, these actual folks. The War Department says we've got to do something. We can't have another Pearl Harbor on our hands. And the State Department says, we don't know what the hell's going on. Right? They were telling us they wanted to calm things down, and this happened. We don't know, you know, we don't know what's going on. So this went around and around and around for, like I say, 10 or 12 weeks in Washington. And so President Roosevelt needed to make a decision. And the decision that he made was a compromise decision. And what he basically decided to do was, he said, okay, here's what we're going to do, right? You know, everybody's giving me all this advice. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to allow for the creation of exclusion zones. I'm going to allow for the creation of exclusion zones. And he issues an executive order 9066, and it's simply 2 pages, very straightforward. And it basically says that the military now has executive power under the, you know, president able to issue executive orders. The military now has the power to create exclusion zones in the United States, and they can keep people out of these zones. In the mind of Roosevelt, he's thinking exclusion zones. He's thinking airports, seaports, railroad crossings, communication centers, rail lines, places that are really important infrastructure for fighting a war, right? We'll keep these guys out of those areas. So you can do that. You can create exclusion zones and keep these guys out of this. So the military gets this, and the military says, wait a minute, so what is this? We can create exclusion zones? And Roosevelt says, yeah, you can create exclusion zones, keep people out of those zones. And the military says, oh, okay, well, that's great, because we only need 2 of them. One will be the entire west coast of the United States, and the other will be about 1/3 of the border along the southern United States. And that's how this happens. So Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, allowing for the creation of exclusion zones, and the military, takes this to say, okay, then we're just going to need 2 of them. We're going to create one entire west coast, and the other about 1/3 of the bottom of the United States. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the Japanese Americans out of these exclusion zones, and everybody goes home a winner, right? Obviously not the Japanese Americans. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, it was an unintended consequence. Okay, it's basically what happened. And you might say, well, geez, Roosevelt should have done something about it, shouldn't he? Couldn't he? He could have, right? He's commander in chief. He could have said, no, that's not what the executive order meant. What I meant was, airports, those sorts of things. But keep in mind what's going on in the world right now. Now, Roosevelt because what happens is December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks the United States. We get into war with Japan. And then 3 days later, on December 11th, Germany declares war on the United States. So now we're in a two-front war, a war in Europe and a war in the Pacific. And Franklin Roosevelt had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War. So he knew what world wars looked like, right? He knew what it was all about. And now, and then World War I was no pillow fight, don't get me wrong, okay? But there was only about 16 million people who died in the First World War. I say only, right? That's a lot, okay? But 60 million people ended up dying in the Second World War. So Roosevelt understood, if we are in a Second World War, this thing is going to be way bigger than the First World War. And he's got a two-front war going on. We're 17th behind Portugal, and our biggest military base, outside the United States has been knocked out of commission. This is what's going through his mind. He doesn't have time to go back and reconsider this, or revalue this, or clarify what the deal is. Now, was that wrong? Ultimately, yes. Can you understand why he did that in the time frame? Probably yes. Okay, but nonetheless, unintended consequence that led to 120,000 Americans, most of them, some of them were just visiting, to be taken out of their homes and to put into these camps. Now, if my mother was here, she would give me a hard time about what I'm about to say, but Canada and countries in South America also rounded up their Japanese citizens. All right, my mom would say, well, two wrongs don't make a right. No, but four rights make a left, don't they? So we have to be very careful about that. So that's the background. That's the story as to why this thing happened. So what actually happened? Well, these guys were told to get out. In some places, they were given 48 hours. In some places, they were given a week. And here's a Japanese poster that would go up, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the following area. Basically, you get out of here and that's it. You go away. So you have to sell your house. You have to close up your business. You have to find somebody to take care of your pet. You have a house full of goods and things, right? What are you going to do with those, right? You got all this stuff that you have to settle up in some places in 48 hours, some places a week or a month, depending upon where you work. And what happens is people come in and some people help them say, look, hey, you're my neighbor, you've been my neighbor for 30 years, put all your stuff in my basement. When this is over, you come back, you get everything. Others were like, ooh, I've been waiting for this. I've been waiting for this. And they went in and took their businesses. They went in and took their homes, those sorts of things. The way that some of these folks were transported to the camps, some of them were just rounded up in the back of trucks. Okay? And just, the truck, like you would do with cattle, or like you would do with vegetables or something. Put them in the back of the truck, round them up, and off they go. Others were sent out by train, and I have a nice picture of that. Here is a picture of them loading up on a train with the Japanese Americans. And what's interesting about this picture is this picture says a lot. This is probably one of the most important pictures from that era, because what you see are a bunch of Japanese Americans, and these folks are dressed to the nines, right? Because these folks were proud Americans, right? They were as upset that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor as anybody else was. But they were good, loyal Americans who said, okay, you know what? I don't like this. I don't like having to leave my stuff. I don't like having to leave my house, but my government thinks it's necessary. I'm going to do it. You can take my house, you can take my business, but you can't take my dignity and you can't take my pride. I'm going, but I'm going looking good, right? And so they dress like they're on their way to church, and they're about to get on this train. The other thing I love about this is if you look at these folks, little old ladies, little men, little men, children, women. These aren't threats, right? These aren't thugs. These are regular folks like us, like you, like me. But look at this here. If you count this, there are 14 soldiers in this picture alone. And what's interesting about this is it shows you how paranoid the military is. They're not taking any chances, right? They're going to put 14 guards on this one group of very kind, conscientious, safe, orderly people to get them on that train. Right? There's going to be no mistake about it. So there's an overwhelming number of firepower here for what we've got going on here. But then look very closely at the helmets these guys are wearing. What do you notice about the helmets? Okay. They're wearing World War I Army helmets. Right, here we are in the opening days of the Second World War. We're going into the Second World War with leftover stuff from the First World War. That shows you how unprepared the United States was, that we were having to go with this old equipment. And again, I'm not saying this as an excuse. I'm not saying this to get anybody off the hook, but the military is scared, right? And they're like, we got to do something. We can't let this sort of thing happen again. Here's an older gentleman. This guy's clearly not a threat, right? Coming off the train, getting put in there, getting moved over, right? There you go. Right. And basically what folks did was they were able to get a big bundle, and you were able to move one bundle of stuff with you. So basically a giant duffel bag. And right, you have one duffel bag that you could go and load all your stuff that you want to take with you for however long you're going to be there, because nobody knows, into a duffel bag and get down to the train station or get down to the truck depot. Imagine that. Right? Imagine that. If, I don't know about you. If I get on a bus and I put my stuff on the seat next to me and somebody asks me to move it, right? Now you got to get everything you got loaded into one bundle and off you go. And these folks were taken off to fairgrounds, baseball stadiums, any place there was an open spot where they could put these folks. That's where they initially went, because it was so quick and so emergency for. Yes.
I want to let you know that on the registration page, there's a link to the photo archive.
Great.
Because it's hard for you to see them here, but when you link on the site, you see them with nice press.
Great. Thank you very much, Jody.
Would you repeat what you said?
She said that on the web page, there's a link to these photos, so you can go and look at them more closely if you want to do that. Thank you very much for that. So these guys are loaded up into baseball parks, fairgrounds, any place there's a big enough area to get groups of people together. And then what happens is the Army goes to work and they begin to build barracks. And here's a picture again. I know you can't see it so well, but go look at this at the website. And it's all these folks being dropped off down here with their bundles, and they're being sent off to live in these barracks.
So how were they housed the first night?
Tents, basically. Tents or stadiums, just basically out there, They've got these barracks that they built were like nothing special, right? It's just basic plywood barracks, plywood, tar paper, that sort of thing. They were about 20 feet wide and about 80 feet long, and no walls inside. So the families were separated by a clothesline with blankets. So it would be your family, a clothesline, a blanket, the next family, as they put these folks in there. Now, Mrs. Roosevelt didn't think this was a good idea. She was like, good old Mrs. Roosevelt, right? Always the humanitarian. And she said, we can't do this. These people aren't the folks that were flying the planes. And it was one of the few times Franklin Roosevelt told her, listen, you know what? Hush, you can't be talking about this. We need to have a unified front. You cannot contradict this policy in public. And she said, okay, I won't in public. And so she went to work behind the scenes. And what she did was she visited the camps. So here's a picture of her visiting the camps. She visited the young folks. She visited the camps. And she basically, said to them, listen, we haven't forgotten you. This is all crazy. We're just trying to figure this out. But, we haven't forgotten who you are. And, we're still working here to try to do something about this. And she went to work getting the young college age kids who were about to go off to college, furloughs out of the camps and into colleges on the East Coast primarily, because there was less anti-Japanese sentiment over here and around here. So these folks got rounded up. They were sent off to these camps, And again, here's a, very stark picture of barracks, of just row after row after row after row after row after row after row. And this is where they ended up living. Now, I want to be very careful about comparisons between these camps and, what the Nazis were doing with their concentration camps. Okay, because these were camps where people were taken and kept. All right, they weren't forced to work. They weren't being killed. They weren't, they were being relatively taken care of. They were given shelter. They were given food. And as the war went on, conditions for the Japanese Americans in these camps got better. So they were able to send away to the Sears catalog and get rugs or Victrolas. They were able to send away to seed catalogs, and they made gardens outside of their barracks in order to trade food with other families so that they could, supplement their diets and those sorts of things. Inside the camps, they set up like a small community. So if you were a Japanese American school teacher, and now you weren't in the regular school district, so guess what? I'm a Japanese American school teacher. I'll teach the Japanese Americans here in this camp. And so they set up schools and did that as well. They organized concerts for themselves, right? So, hey, we're all put away there, right? And hey, I play a violin. Oh, you play guitar. Hey, you play harmonica, right? So, all right, let's start a little band. And they would put on concerts for each other and for themselves. But all this going on from behind barbed wire, right? And what happened was, as the war went on, and we began to see that these guys really weren't the threat that everybody thought that they were offered, the young men were offered an opportunity to get out of the camps, right? And some of the guys were furloughed, so you could go, like, you'd be in the camp and you'd go in to like Albany and do some work in Albany or whatever, but at the end of the night you had to come back, right? Because you're checked into your job, so we know you're working, so we know you're not being a saboteur or anything like that. But nighttime you got to come back into the camp. The young men were offered an opportunity. Hey, you guys want to get out of here? All you got to do is to swear an allegiance to the United States. That's all. Just swear an allegiance to the United States. And the argument was, why should I do that? Why do I have to do that? Did anybody else swear an allegiance? Right? You pledge an allegiance to the flag, but none of you, if you're American citizens, right? You're American citizens because you were born here. Unless you have a job, right? I work for the government, so I had to swear an allegiance to the Constitution. But most people don't have to do that. You're just born, you're an American, there you are. So why do these folks, these Americans, why are they required to take this oath? That was the argument. Why do I have to do that? Well, because we want to make sure that you're a loyal American. I am a loyal American. I've lived here I was born here. I don't know anything else. I've never been to Japan. I'm as American as anybody, except kid born in Chicago or Cleveland. And if you refuse to take the oath, guess where you stay? Right smack dab in the camp, right? Because if you're not willing to take an oath to the United States, then maybe you are a spy. Maybe you are somebody we need to keep an eye on. And of course, their argument was, no, we're not. But it's just, you know how it is when your integrity is challenged, right? My wife does this all the time, right? There'll be cheese in the refrigerator, right? And then she'll go, and then there won't be cheese in the refrigerator. And then she'll go, did you eat the cheese? It's like, no, I didn't eat the cheese. Well, it's not in there, right? You'd be like, well, I don't know what happened to it. Well, I bought cheese. Well, I'm sure you did, but now I don't know where it is. Well, neither do I. Right? And it goes back and forth, right? So now you're forced to like overprove the fact that you didn't eat the cheese, right? It's like, no, I'm telling you, I never saw the cheese in there. That's all there should be to it, right? And the same thing with these guys with the camps. Like I said, they got these small little areas, maybe 20 by 15 feet or so for the families. It was tough at first, very, very tough, right? You're uprooted, off you go. There you are. And next thing you know, you're in these camps and you only have a bag full of stuff. What's going on with my puppy? What's going on with my business? What's going on with my home? Well, hopefully somebody's taking care of that for you. But you had 48 hours or, a month or a week, depending where you were, to get your business in order. And these folks ended up staying in the camps primarily for the rest of the war. Average stay for the Japanese Americans was almost 3 years in these camps. Some folks were in the camps as late as 1946. Yeah, the war's over in 45, and they stay in the camps. Why? What are they going to go back to? Can't go back. Somebody took my business. Can't go back. Somebody took my home. Can't go back. I got nothing back there. Right? The guy that had the stuff in the basement got tired of it, sold it all. Right? So many of these folks had to relocate in other places in the country because they didn't want to go back to where they had been forced out of. Why should I go back? I didn't do anything. Right? I didn't do anything. And so that was the way that this ended up playing out. There were only 2 challenges to this in the courts. And each time the Supreme Court upheld the executive order, saying, look, things are just too crazy. This is not that big of an inconvenience. Well, not for you, it's not, but for me it is. And so they said, all right, the executive order stands, everything's fine. And that's the way it's going to be. And when the war was over, they opened the gates. Okay, guys, thanks for your time. There you go. Where do I go? What do I do?
We didn't compensate them at all.
Not at all. Not in the beginning. Not in the beginning. All right. War's over. Now we got to rebuild Europe. Get these guys coming back. We got to find jobs. There you go. So it wasn't until like 35 years later that they finally started to take notice of this and say, okay, we got to do something. So President Ford said, all right, I'm going to create a commission to look at this. So he started a commission to look into what happened and why it happened and reparations and all that sort of stuff. And then he lost the 1976 election. So then Jimmy Carter became president. He kept the commission and he said, okay, yeah, keep working. Let's find out what's going on here, see what's going on, and we'll do something about it. And then it wasn't until then he lost election, right, in 1980. So Ronald Reagan was president, and he took the recommendations of the committee, and he said, yeah, this was not a good thing, right? And he apologized to the Japanese Americans, right? 40 years later, okay, 40 years later, that's like my wife coming in a week later and saying, oh, I found the cheese, I left it in the car. It's like, what? Our marriage is on the rocks now because of this. No, it was on the rocks. Oh, I'm not just kidding. That's none of your business. So Reagan apologizes, and then what they end up doing is they end up creating reparations. So everybody that was in the camp got $20,000 as a reparation 40 years later, and and an apology. And a lot of those checks didn't go out until the first President Bush was still sending out those checks. And that's how long it took. So it started with Ford, and it took, so you had Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, 5 presidents before this thing was finally ended up being resolved. Now, this is a really important lesson for all of us. A really, really important lesson for all of us, because what it shows us is in a national crisis, in a national emergency, the first victims are the folks that are being attacked or being, taken advantage of. The second victims are likely to be our civil rights, right? Because everybody gets all riled out. Oh, we got to do something, right? And so if something goes down, you got to take a look. Obviously you have sympathy for the victims and help them out and everything. But the next thing is, let's not overreact and take away our civil rights, right? If you remember, after the attack on September 11th, right? And all of a sudden, the extra, security with Arab Americans and all that sort of stuff. French fries were recalled freedom fries, right? Everything went nuts. Everybody, the cable guy could report you, right? That was part of their job, come into your house when they're putting cable in, look around, see what's going on. They see anything suspicious, see something, say something, that sort of thing. So this is a lesson for all of us. And we saw this even with the pandemic, right? Big national world crisis, a world pandemic. And all of a sudden, it becomes an issue of civil rights. You have no right to tell me to wear a mask. You have no right to tell me to get a vaccination. If you're telling me to wear a mask for this, what's to tell me that you're not going to do that for something else? If you're making me get a vaccine for this, how's the, what's next? What's going to be the thing? It becomes a slippery slope. And I know it sounds silly, and I know it sounds, like, oh, that's not going to happen. How do you know? How do you know? Right? if you had said to Japanese Americans living on the West Coast in mid-December of 1941, you know, in 6 weeks, you're going to be hauled out of here, they wouldn't have believed you. No, not in America. It wouldn't happen in America. It couldn't happen to us, you know, and it did. Okay, so that's one of the first things with the lessons that we learned is that we need to keep an eye on our civil rights. Our civil rights are only as good as a handshake, basically, right? They can be taken away pretty well like that. One executive order and 120,000 Americans lost their civil rights just like that. It also shows us that, you know, we need to be careful of unintended consequences. Right? We need to be careful of unintended consequences. So if the government does something, or if there's a policy to do something, we have to make sure that it's not going to have some unintended consequence that creates another problem, or that just kicks the problem down the road. Right? So we have to be careful about that. That's another lesson that we learned. And it shows that the power to provide for the public good, right, can be used in ways that are not so good.
Gotta be abused.
Yeah, the idea of creating an exclusion zone for the public good. Let's create these exclusion zones around the airports and the seaports and those sort of things. That'll keep those places safe. That'll keep us in operation and all of that. But it was taken and then made into the two exclusion zones, the West Coast and the southern part of the United States. So we need to be careful about that as well. This stands as, again, one of the biggest blemishes on the Roosevelt administration. Could he have done something different about it? Probably. He could have said, no, that's not what I meant. Let's take another look at this. But his hands were full. His plate was full. He was fighting a two-front war. That's not by excuse. It's simply by explanation. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any information about physicians who were put on Indian reservations? I worked at an Indian reservation out in North Dakota, and we had somebody, but we didn't never discuss that. He had been a physician.
I don't know anything about that.
And we don't have any records.
We might.
I don't know whether he was in a camp and sent there or volunteered. He and his family and two small children.
Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't say one way or the other, but we might, we have 17.5 million pages of documents in our collection. That would be a stack 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument if you stack them all on top of each other. So there could very well be information. And we have 50,000 books in our book collection. And how many you guys have here, do you know? So that's a lot of books. Yes, sir.
Could you explain something in the background of Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor? I understand there's they were trying to have an exclusion zone in the Pacific. Part of it was that somehow the U.S. was involved in cutting off the oil flow to Japan. Can you explain what the U.S. involvement was with the Asian oil flow to Japan?
That's a great point. That's exactly what happened. In the summer before, the United States had been selling scrap steel and oil to Japan, and making money doing that. And then we realized, well, wait a minute, they're using this. First of all, they're stockpiling the oil, which is never good because that means they're going to use it for something, something big. And we decided, okay, this isn't good. We got to stop this. So we cut off the oil supply to the Japanese, and we also cut off the steel supply. And what this did was it backed them further into a corner. We have in our collection a Japanese army helmet, which is made out of bamboo, because they ran out of steel, right? Better to have something than nothing, right? And so that was part of the reason, that was another thing that antagonized the Japanese. Like, wait a minute, now we really need to take over our neighbors because we can't even buy this stuff anymore. And that's basically what happened.
How did they cut it off? Did they own the oil, the U.S., or did they force the people who own the oil and the steel to cut it off? How did that take place?
Yeah, we didn't own it, but we basically, put injunctions against businesses doing business with Japan. Just like we have now, like, there's there's an embargo against China for technology, right? So, okay, we're gonna put these guys on, you can't trade with these guys, lists.
This was before 41.
Yeah, this is before 40. This is, well, actually, it's in 41. It's in the summertime of 41. So the Japanese, and I'm not giving them a free lunch on this either. But think about it, right? You're trying to take over the world, and the guys that are selling you oil aren't selling you oil anymore. The guys that are selling you steel aren't selling you steel anymore. This potential adversary is building this bigger and bigger base all the time. It's going to force you to do something, right? It's like I always think of it in terms of like if there's a skunk in your garage, right? You can get the broom and the garbage can lid and go after that skunk, right? And get him out of your garage, but there's a really good chance you're going to get sprayed, okay? Or you can just let the skunk do whatever he wants to do, and eventually he'll leave, but he also might make babies in there, or maybe he'll eat stuff or do whatever, so you have to kind of play it out. What are you going to do? Do we take the chance now, or do we take the chance later? Yes, ma'am.
Japanese Americans sue is that the precedent that led to reparations?
No, not directly. The Supreme Court twice heard cases of Japanese Americans, and there were only two, and there was no violence. These guys weren't like, hell no, we won't go. Yeah. Well, afterwards, it was recognized as not a good thing to have done. And in the rights movement, civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, those sorts of things. Hey, what about our rights? We're American citizens. All our stuff got taken away because somebody over in another country attacked a base 3,000 miles from here. So, so there was no direct link to that, but we recognized pretty early on that this was not a good thing to do, not a nice thing to do. And so, we worked toward correcting that as best we could. Now, George Takei, let me just say this one thing. George Takei, he played Sulu on the original Star Trek. Right? He has like he does like a lot of tweeting and blogging and all that. He was actually rounded up in the Japanese American internment, and as a 5-year-old, the knock on the door came, and the soldiers took him and put him in the truck, and off they went. He came to our library about 4 years ago to give a talk, and about the whole situation and how he went through. And he said, so somebody asked him, like, well, what did you think when you got the invitation to come and talk here? And he said, well, it's funny you should say that, because I was driving up to Taconic, coming in from New York, I was driving up to Taconic, and I was thinking to myself, this is him talking, I was thinking to myself, I am going to give a talk at the home of the guy that issued the order that forced me to lose my home when I was 5 years old. And yet I've been invited to come and give a talk and tell my side of the story. And he said, that's what I love about America. It takes a while, but we usually will do the right thing. Here in the movie road. Yes.
I know they weren't luxurious camps, but it's amazing to me how quickly they put all those camps up to have 120,000 people live there. It's been a massive undertaking. But my other thought about that was it was still technically the end of the Depression. They're putting massive amounts of men to work building these camps.
Yep. Absolutely.
They were able to do it so quickly.
Yeah, they were able to do that quick because that's exactly what it was. You had a lot of this surplus workers. Now, a lot of after the attack, a lot of these guys went, joined up right away to join the army and such. But there were a lot of folks that wouldn't qualify to be in the army for whatever reason. So yeah, they went right to work. All right, let's get these guys and we'll put them in these these things and we'll build these barracks. And again, these were like stick and plywood buildings. These weren't fancy. These were not fancy at all. Especially initially. They got a little fancier as time went on. But that's just imagine that. Like knock, 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 get out. Where am I going? Get in the truck. It's like that's pretty heavy duty in America. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I just want to say I enjoyed your presentation. I think it was very thought-provoking. My parents were Californian Japanese Americans. They were rounded up at Santa Anita Racetrack, and the families were relocated to Hart Mountain, Wyoming.
Yep.
The barracks, which were hastily constructed, and I went to visit Hart Mountain just before COVID hit. Where, as you say, just plywood, tar paper, the wind, it was very windy there. The wind would blow through, the sand would blow through. There was no privacy, even in like the trees. But as you say, they were within the barbed wire confines and the towers with gunmen, guards. They were able to form their own clubs. My mother taught sewing to the women there. I think that generation, they were so busy coping, and many had come from the tradition in Japan, which is a very small, homogeneous island community, very crowded, volcanic mountains on the interior, so all the people live on the edge. They were used to following regulations, doing what they were told. So that first generation, as you say, I think, put up with it. It was their offspring, the subsequent generations, that brought, the injustice of the situation to people's attention.
Right.
My parents' families lost everything, and as you say, I think they were given $20 each when they left camp, enough gas money to get them someplace else.
Right.
And yet, and my father, who was a graduate student in Illinois at the time this all occurred, he was not in an exclusion zone, so he was not relocated, but his family was. But both my parents, who came to settle here, my father got a job at Sterling Winthrop Research Institute, if you remember, on the hill there down in Leesburg. They both never said anything negative about their experience.
You're right. I mean, they put up with it. They didn't enjoy it. They didn't like it.
Well, they loved this country.
Exactly. But they loved the fact that, hey, you know what? If this is, again, speaks to this idea of today's generation, is it for the public good for me to do this? This 120,000 people, if it makes the country safer, if it helps us win the war any quicker, we'll do it, and that's exactly thank you for sharing that, because, that's exactly how it was. Sometimes people don't understand that. What do you mean they didn't say anything? It's like, well, that's,
Well, I think an interesting and unfortunate aspect of this is sometimes there was generational conflict within families because the younger people didn't understand why their parents put up with it.
Right.
Why didn't you fight back?
yeah, why do we have to do this? All my other friends got to stay where they got to stay. They're going to the Bobby Sox things and all that sort of stuff. And I'm in a camp. What's going on? Yeah, absolutely. There was a lot of, as with any of that stuff, there's always more emotional turmoil than you realize. Even this pandemic, this is gonna be with us a long time. Even if they said tomorrow, okay, it's all gone, the psychological stuff stays with you. We saw this a lot with people in depression too. If you lived through the depression, you saved everything. I can remember my grandmother, getting cookies at the bakery and winding up that string and putting it in the drawer because you never knew when you were going to need string, so that whole generation that went without that, it's that stuff stays with you. It stays with you. Let's go. Let's go here. And we'll work our way
Were
back.
any of the people able to reacquire what was taken from them? Like they talk about the Jewish people suing for their paintings and what.
Right.
Were any of the,
Not that I mean, there may have been, if you had friends that you said, okay, here, can you hang on to this? This is my piano, can you hang on to this piano? You might have been able to go back and get that, later on.
but only if they were willing to give it.
Yeah, only if they were willing to give it to you and only if they had taken care of it, and, it was tough times, it was tough times. So, I'm sure there were opportunities for people to go back and, sort of say, okay, look at, you're the junior partner in this business, I got to go here, when I come back, and you came back and maybe the guy said, oh, great, welcome back. Or maybe the guy said, well, too bad, I'm the guy running the show. Let's go back here and we'll work our way to the gentleman and back up. Yes, ma'am.
you go by your last name. Japanese woman, American, her history, Japanese.
Right. Well, a lot of it was simply by looks. You know, if you look Japanese, off you go. Sorry, pal, that's the way it is. I'm not proud to say that, but that's how a lot of it was. And then there were other, there were people, like, again, it was the folks that you were more, like, you could probably, you might be able to lay low, and avoid some of this, or maybe get out on your own before you were thrown out. But basically, it was the biggest thing from the government standpoint that we learned from this is that this was a failure in leadership on the part of President Roosevelt, who should have gone back and said, okay, these guys aren't doing anything. Let's let them out. Let's get this under control. So there was a failure of leadership on that. And there is a huge undercurrent of racism. That's why there's 1,200 Japanese arrested, 900 Germans, 86 Italians. Yes.
I think a lot of it, as you say, was based on appearance. And for that reason, other Asian Americans used to wear armbands to identify that they were
Right.
not.
I'm Chinese.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So they didn't get caught up in that thing. Yes, sir.
Japanese during the war proceeding Pearl Harbor was being asked as far as the soldiers coming into the harbor, as far as the slavery, atrocity, rape, and whatnot. Was that generally known to the public at that time?
It was getting out bits and pieces. I think that, you could argue that a lot of armies were doing that sort of stuff, which again, doesn't make it right. But the nationalism that had been going on for like 2 generations, really leading up to the war, really allowed people this ability to separate themselves out from other folks. So I could be mean and obnoxious and brutal to you because you're subhuman. You're not really a human like me. And that's kind of what a lot of these guys were indoctrinated into. And Hitler was doing the same thing, with the Jews. We did the same thing with African Americans, right? The 1925 Army War College report described African Americans as a subspecies of the human family.
1925?
1925. So, again, it doesn't make it right, but that's why we have to, again, be careful when I talk to kids. It's like, be careful about the name calling. Be careful about the using and theming. Because if it's us and them, it's a lot easier for me to do things to them because they're not us. You know what I'm saying? And it gets crazy like that. Let's go with this gentleman and then we'll work our way through here.
We talk about that we should learn consequences. And I think that's good. Shouldn't be consequences.
That happened in a different presidential era, and I will let you get the guy from the Bush Library in here to talk about that. How's that for a weasel answer? Yeah, no, my job is not to criticize the government or to pontificate about public policy. It's simply to give you the history. So again, like with this idea was that, and then draw some conclusions about what we might learn from that. So again, it wasn't like, FDR said, oh, I hate Japanese, let's round them all up. There was a 6 or 8 week, 10 week, 12 week debate about what we're going to do about this kind of thing. And they made it a compromise decision. The compromise decision was then incorrectly, implemented by the military, and it led to 120,000, Japanese Americans being interned. So I don't mean that as an excuse, but that's just the chain of events that occurred. So, the same, with some of these other times in history, a lot of times, history is 2020. You don't learn it until, you see it later on and you think, okay, there you go. And somebody once said that history repeats itself. And I don't think that it does. I hate that because, oh, history repeats itself. It doesn't repeat itself. I don't think. It echoes. Right? It comes back as an echo, right? It's never exactly the same, right? It comes back if you say, hello, 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 right? It's the same word, but it's coming back with a different intensity. It's coming back from a different direction. It's coming back at a different time. And so we can learn some of these lessons of history, but we have to make sure we're learning the right ones. And sometimes you don't know if you've learned the right ones until you've learned the wrong ones. Yes, sir.
what I found out is, thinking about this, was the Americans, Japanese, they put them in a home, isolated them, but put them in their own home.
Mhm.
What happened to the ones who were captured by the Japanese and Germans? The Americans are captured, the British were captured, French were captured, put in prison camps. And it was all over, whether it was Japanese or whether it was the Germans. They were all put in prison camps, not given homes.
Right, right. Right, well, again, that's the difference of that is, and I'm not a military legal scholar, but the guys that were in the war, those were combatants, right? These folks were just regular, ordinary citizens. So, you know, that speaks to somewhat of the differentiation in the way of the treatment.
Another thing I want to mention was we were short on everything. The Japanese at least had rubber.
Mhm.
To do anything they need to do with rubber, tires on the vehicles or whatever it may be. We didn't have rubber for anything.
Right, but they were low on oil, so you could have all the rubber you want, all the good tires, but if you can't drive it,
They had more oil than we had.
well, eventually things began to balance out and such. But the point is that this was an opportunity for us to have shown some leadership, and we ended up failing. We got these guys because we thought it was a good idea, and we've all been in these things. You all think things are good ideas, and then you come to find out that they're not such good ideas.
One thing I failed to mention was that the Americans set up the homes for everybody, whereas the Japanese and Germans and the Chinese put them all in prison camps.
Yeah,
And it wasn't fair. I don't think.
No, but again, that's why when the war ended, when the war was getting ready to end, a lot of the Germans were doing everything they could to surrender to the Americans, not the Russians, because different countries take different reactions and treat people in different ways. So and there are stories of German POW camps in the United States, and the guys were like, "This is great. You guys are treating us wonderfully." Because that's what we do as Americans. Yes, ma'am.
The reparations that the US government made to those Japanese Americans who were still living at the time, 40, 50 years later, when the reparations were made. I think only in this country would that sort of thing happen.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it might have been, hey, sorry, oops, there you go.
Exactly.
And of course, that leads to questions of what about other people, right? What about Native Americans? What about, so, and again, that's beyond my scope of ability. Let's go here and then we'll go right back to you, sir.
I'm curious, you said 20,000. Was that per family? Was that per
It's
person?
per individual.
So a husband and wife and the children?
If you were in there, that was
If
your,
you were surviving,
Yeah.
my grandparents didn't survive.
yeah, if you
but
were
my
dead,
mother did.
your
She was-
ancestor, if you were in there and you passed away, it
So
wasn't like it went to
their
somebody.
descendants didn't get it.
No.
It was
No.
only the
Yeah,
people that
only the
were
living,
physically
real
there.
live people. Yep.
We put a positive spin on FDR. I recently read a book called Rightful Heritage by Douglas Brinkley about FDR's involvement with national parks. Stuff. It's a spectacular book, very well written.
Funny you should say that. I was just with Doug Brinkley last night. He was at the library and he was talking about that very book. Yeah, it's part of a series. There's like 3 of them that lead up to that. So yeah, Doug Brinkley, he's one of our trustees, and he was just at the museum last night giving a talk. And I think we taped it. So I think if you go to our YouTube page or whatever, maybe not today because they got to edit it or whatever. But if you're interested in that, go to our YouTube page. Just go to our website, FDR Library, and you'll be able to see it there. So you'll be able to see that. Yes, ma'am.
Article about Japanese American young men in our military who were meritorious, were honored and given medals and all that. I think that should be brought
That's a great point, and you're right, I should have mentioned that. The Nisei soldiers who served and fought for the right to serve, they fought primarily, they primarily fought in and around the Mediterranean. And some of them, some of their units would receive like 300% casualties because they were going out of their way to prove what they, they didn't need to prove, they were Americans, but that's a good point. Thank you very much for bringing that out. And it was a big deal. If you had, if you go to the pictures, there's actually, I think I've got one here. You can show you. Whoops. I probably won't be able to find it because you know how that goes. Oh, here's one. There's one of the guys right there. And the families would have their pictures taken with, here we are here. So here is a Japanese American family. Their son is in the war. He's fighting for the United States. This guy's too young. And, here they are in front of an American flag, and the picture's taken where? Inside a camp. So there you go. All right, well, thank you very much for having me in. And Judy, I think it worked. The hybrid thing seems to have worked.
We did it.
Woohoo!